In April of 2024, on the 22nd floor of a glass office building in downtown Denver, a meeting had been running for 3 hours and had produced nothing except a growing silence that nobody in the room knew how to fill. There were 7 lawyers on one side of the table. They represented Mesa Verde Agritech, one of the largest agricultural infrastructure companies in the American West. And between them, they had logged more than 200 combined years in courtrooms, arbitration chambers, and negotiating tables across 4 states. They had drafted the contracts that governed $340 million in irrigation infrastructure. They had permits. They had surveys. They had engineering reports that ran to 11 volumes and weighed more than most men could comfortably carry. On the other side of the table sat a woman with gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a manila folder that was not especially thick. Her name was Clara Marsh. She was 66 years old. She had practiced water rights law in Colorado for 23 years. The project was frozen, not delayed, not under review. Frozen. The word the project manager had used in his email to the board 3 days earlier was paralyzed. And that word was accurate. 40,000 acres of farmland in La Plata County were sitting above an ancient aquifer that Mesa Verde needed to survive the worst drought the region had seen in 1,200 years. The permits were approved. The wells were designed. The drilling equipment was staged and ready. And none of it could move because of a single certificate filed in 1899 that belonged to a 96-year-old man sitting at a kitchen table in La Plata County 340 miles away, who had paid $45 a year to keep that certificate active since 1981, and who had never once been late. The lead attorney for Mesa Verde, a man named Patrick Drummond, looked at Clara Marsh across the table and asked her what her client wanted. Clara opened the folder. She took out one sheet of paper and set it in the center of the table and pushed it toward him with 2 fingers. Drummond looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at it again. He had been in this business for 31 years. He had handled condemnation proceedings, eminent domain disputes, interstate water compacts, and federal easement negotiations. He had sat across from governors and senators and the legal teams of Fortune 500 companies. He had never in his career seen terms like those. Eldon Marsh had been waiting 43 years for that meeting. He did not need to be there. That is where this story ends. Now, let me take you back to where it begins, because a man like Eldon Marsh deserves to be told about properly. And the beginning is the only place that makes the end make any sense at all. The summer of 1981 was dry in La Plata County. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of dry that made the news or brought government men in white sedans, but the ordinary grinding dryness of a western Colorado August that settled into the land like a debt and collected interest in cracked soil and short tempers in fields that yielded a little less than a man had counted on. It was the kind of summer that made farmers quiet at the diner and quieter at home, and it had been that way for 3 years running. The auction was held on a Saturday morning in the county building on Arbles Road, the kind of utilitarian space that served triple duty as a meeting hall, a polling location, and now, on this particular morning, a place where the county was disposing of certain administrative remnants that had accumulated over decades of paperwork and changing priorities. There were folding tables arranged in a square. There was a coffee urn near the door that someone had filled before 8, and that nobody had tended to since. There were perhaps 20 people in the room, most of them local, most of them farmers or adjacent to farming in one way or another, and most of them there for the same 3 or 4 items on the auction sheet that represented actual working land or equipment. Eldon Marsh sat in the second row. He had driven 40 minutes to get there. He was 53 years old, recently retired after 22 years as the head of the county irrigation district, and he had the look of a man who had spent those 22 years outdoors reading land and water and sky rather than reports, though he had read plenty of those too. His hands were the kind of hands that came from decades of physical work. Not rough exactly, but substantial. The hands of a man who understood tools and the things tools were designed to do. He wore the sport coat he wore to church in winter and to his daughter's school events. A dark wool blazer that had been a good one when he bought it and had aged into something better. The kind of garment that fit a man so well after years of wearing that it had become simply part of how he moved through the world. In the left inside pocket of that coat was a small notebook. In the right inside pocket was a folded receipt from the county recorder's office. He had put both there that morning before he left the house. His wife Vera had asked him if he wanted coffee before he went. He said he was fine. She said she might be in the garden when he got back. He said that was all right. He kissed her on the cheek and drove to Arbalest Road and sat down in the second row and waited. He was not a man who fidgeted. He had learned across more than 2 decades of watching water move through land that patience was not a passive condition. It was a form of attention. The men who fidgeted were the men who were waiting for something to happen to them. Eldon was not waiting for something to happen to him. He was watching a room, reading it the way he had always read land, looking for the thing that was there, but that nobody else had yet identified as significant. The auction moved through its morning inventory at the pace such things always move, which is to say, slower than anyone who came for a specific item would prefer. There was equipment. There was a small parcel of county-held land with a drainage easement attached that generated a modest amount of interest, and a final bid that satisfied nobody in the room. There was a mineral filing that nobody bid on at all. The auctioneer, a compact man named Gerald, whose real job was running the county assessor's secondary office, moved through each item with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to editorialize. Then he read out the next item. County Water Record Number 44-A, Certificate of Prior Appropriation, originally filed October 1899. Dyer Creek and associated tributaries, La Plata County, Colorado. Senior water right, first priority status. Creek last recorded active surface flow, 1957. Certificate maintained in continuous administrative standing. Gerald paused. He looked around the room. He said the county had determined the certificate was surplus to current administrative needs, which was a formal way of saying that nobody had known what to do with it for decades, and it had finally made its way onto an auction sheet. He started the bidding at $500. Nothing. He dropped to $350. Nothing. Across the room near the door by the empty coffee urn, a man named Vernon Gaines stood with his arms crossed and his weight on one hip. Vernon was 40 years old and managed the main branch of First Mesa Bank on the county seat's main street, a position he had held for 4 years and intended to hold as a stepping stone towards something larger, which in Vernon's understanding of the world meant regional management, which meant a bigger office in a bigger city with a better parking situation. He was a tall man with a good haircut and a Windsor knotted tie that was slightly too formal for a Saturday county auction, and he held a legal pad that he had brought for the 3 items of actual interest to the bank, all of which had already sold. He had stayed for no particular reason except that leaving felt like admitting the morning had been a waste. He looked at the certificate description on the sheet he was holding. He looked at Gerald the auctioneer. He looked at the room. He said loud enough for the 8 or 10 people nearest to him to hear clearly that he wasn't sure what a man would do with a senior right on a creek that had been dry since Eisenhower was president. 2 of the people near him smiled. One laughed short and easy, the comfortable laugh of a man who appreciated a well-timed remark in a slow Saturday morning. Gerald dropped the opening bid to $200, then $150. Eldon Marsh raised his hand when the number reached $340. He did not raise it high. He raised it the way a man raises his hand when he is answering a question he has already thought through completely, without hesitation, but also without performance. Gerald acknowledged him. He looked around the room for a counter. There was none. He looked at Vernon Gaines, who had turned to look at Eldon, taking in the sport coat, the age, the stillness of the man in the second row. Vernon said something. He said it across the room, directed at no one specifically, and therefore directed at everyone, which was precisely the effect he intended. He said it looked like Eldon had just bought himself the right to a dry creek bed in a county that had 17 of them already. He paused. Then he said what he considered the line. He said Eldon had just paid $340 for the right to drink dust. 3 people laughed, not cruelly, the way people laugh at county auctions on dry August Saturdays when the coffee is gone, and the bidding is slow, which is to say, out of boredom and mild amusement, and the particular comfort of agreeing publicly with the confident man in the room. Eldon did not turn around. He did not look at Vernon Gaines. He looked at Gerald, who brought the gavel down and announced the sale, and then Eldon stood and walked to the clerk's table at the front and signed the transfer form in his clear, unhurried hand. He paid in cash. He took the certificate and the receipt and folded them together into quarters and put them in the right inside pocket of his sport coat, next to the notebook that was already in the left. He walked to the door. He passed within 6 feet of Vernon Gaines. Vernon was already looking at something else, already composing in his mind the story he would tell about the retired irrigation man who had spent his Saturday buying a dust certificate, a story that would be mildly funny at a dinner table that week and forgotten by the following Monday. Eldon Marsh said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had known exactly what he was buying for 3 months before he bought it, and he had known for 3 months before that what it would eventually be worth. And he had known since he was a young man, working his first season in the county water office, that the single most consequential skill a person could have was the ability to understand something completely, while everyone around them understood it. Not at all. He turned off the light on his way out because no one else was positioned to do it, and it seemed wasteful to leave it on. He drove home. Vera was on the porch with a glass of water and her reading glasses. She asked how it went. He said fine. She asked if he got what he went for. He said yes. She went inside to start lunch. Eldon sat on the porch step for a moment and looked at the line of mountains to the north and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has done exactly what he planned and has no need to discuss it with anyone. Now let me tell you what Eldon actually bought, because it was not what Vernon Gaines thought it was, and it was not what anyone else in that room thought it was. And understanding the difference between what it appeared to be and what it actually was requires going back to the months before the auction, and before that, to the geological history of a corner of La Plata County that most people had driven past for decades without reading correctly. Dyer Creek had gone dry on the surface in 1957. That was the recorded fact. That was what the county maps showed, what the water district reports noted, what anyone consulting official records would find. The creek bed was there, visible, a slight depression running north to south through the eastern section of the county. But it had carried no surface water in 24 years by the time Eldon sat in that auction room. County records categorized the water right attached to it as dormant. Administrative records showed continuous filing, which was technically required, But no one had reviewed those records with any serious attention in a long time. Eldon had reviewed them, not casually, methodically, the way he had always approached water, which was with the understanding that water did not disappear. It went somewhere. The job was to figure out where. 3 months before the auction, he had spent 6 days at the county library and 3 trips to the Colorado State Archives in Denver, reading the original geological survey conducted by the United States Geological Survey in 1899. The same year, Certificate 44A had been filed. The survey was handwritten 91 pages and had not been digitized because it predated the programs that would have digitized it and had fallen into the category of historical document that existed in the record without being particularly consulted by anyone. What the survey described in the careful, technical language of a government geologist working at the end of the 19th century was a watershed system in which Dyer Creek fed not only surface flow, but a subsurface aquifer formation of considerable depth and capacity, an ancient water-bearing layer of limestone and gravel that sat roughly 60 to 80 feet below the surface of the eastern county farmland. The survey noted that the creek and the aquifer were hydraulically connected, meaning that whatever fed one fed the other, and that the aquifer itself was old enough and deep enough that it was largely isolated from surface-level drought cycles. In 1899, this was a geological observation. In 1981, sitting in the county library with that survey open on a wooden table, under a fluorescent light that buzzed faintly, every 12 seconds, Eldon Marsh understood it as something else. There had been a small seismic event in La Plata County in 1952. Not significant enough to cause structural damage, not the kind of thing that made a lasting impression on the county's collective memory, but documented in the state geological records Eldon had also pulled. A seismic event of that magnitude in that specific location along the geological formations the 1899 survey had mapped would have been sufficient to shift the subsurface drainage patterns, not enough to destroy the creek's connection to the aquifer, enough to redirect the surface expression of that connection downward. The creek had not died. The creek had gone underground. Eldon had written in his notebook in his clear, economical hand, "The water did not leave. It went deeper. The right still governs it." And then below that he had written the most important thing, the thing that transformed a geological observation into a 43-year strategy. He had written 1899, first in time, first in right. In Colorado, water law operates on a doctrine called prior appropriation. It is a system built not on proximity to water, not on property ownership, not on permits issued in living memory, but on the principle that whoever first put water to beneficial use has the senior claim, and that claim does not expire as long as the right is maintained. The certificate filed in 1899 for Dyer Creek and its associated tributaries was not just old. It was senior to every other water right in that part of the county. Every irrigation permit, every municipal allocation, every agricultural claim that had been filed in La Plata County in the 82 years between 1899 and 1981 sat junior to Certificate 44A. If anyone ever needed to access the aquifer beneath the eastern county farmland, the aquifer that Dyer Creek fed and that the 1899 survey had mapped, and that the 1952 seismic event had sealed more deeply into the earth, they would have to come to whoever held 44A first, and they would have to come with something worth accepting. Eldon had not told anyone this, not Vera, not his former colleagues at the Water District, not his daughter Clara, who was 23 years old in 1981 and studying pre-law at Colorado State in Fort Collins, and who was sharp enough that he suspected she would have understood it immediately if he had explained it to her. He had not explained it to anyone. He had bought the certificate for $340 and paid the annual maintenance fee of $45 in April of each subsequent year and waited. He paid that fee in 1982. He paid it in 1983 and 1984. And every year after that, always in April. Always by certified check mailed to the state engineer's office in Denver. Always on time. The receipts came back and he folded them into quarters and put them in the right inside pocket of the sport coat which he wore to church in cold weather, and to significant occasions, and to the county building on Arbalez Road on a dry Saturday morning when he was 53 years old, and certain that something he understood completely had been missed entirely by everyone else in the room. By 1988, there were 8 receipts in that pocket. By 1995, 15. The notebook accumulated entries alongside them, not daily, not even monthly, but specific and dated. Observations about land sales in the Eastern County, notes on development inquiries that reached his former colleagues at the Water District, a clipping from the Durango Herald about a regional infrastructure study that identified the Eastern County aquifer as a significant potential resource. He did not underline things dramatically. He noted them the way he had always noted things, the way a man who spent 22 years tracking where water went learns to note the things that matter, which is carefully and without announcement. He mowed the creek bed twice a year, June and September. The county had no particular reason to ask why. He had a right attached to it, and he maintained it. That was enough. Vera knew about the mowing and knew about the $45, and knew that Eldon considered both necessary, and she did not ask for a more detailed explanation, because in 40 years of marriage she had learned that Eldon's silences were not the silences of a man with nothing to say. They were the silences of a man who was still watching and who would speak when speaking was required. In the winter of 1994, a letter arrived from the state engineer's office. It was formal and measured and written in the careful language of bureaucratic inquiry, which is to say that it used many words to communicate a relatively simple threat. The office had received inquiries, the letter said, regarding the administrative status of certain legacy water certificates in La Plata County. As part of a review process, the office was requesting documentation of beneficial use for certificates not showing active surface diversion. Certificate 44A was on the review list. Eldon read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in February. He was 66 years old. The notebook was open in front of him and his hand rested flat on the page, the way a man's hand rests on something he has been carrying for a long time. It was 11 at night. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the juniper trees along the fence line with the particular sound that February wind makes in the high country, which is less a howl than a sustained patient pressure. He sat with the letter for a long time. He was not afraid exactly. Eldon Marsh was not a man who frightened easily, and his understanding of water law was thorough enough that he was not without options. But he was aware in that cold, quiet kitchen of the weight of 13 years of waiting and $45 and the folded receipts in his coat pocket, and the notebook under his hand. And he permitted himself for the length of that evening to consider the possibility that he had calculated wrong, that the corridor was closing, that the patience required something more than patience. Vera appeared at the kitchen doorway at some point in the middle of that consideration. She did not come in. She did not ask what the letter said or what he was thinking. She looked at him for a moment, at his hand on the notebook, and the letter beside it, and the stillness that he wore like a second coat. Then she walked to the counter and poured coffee into a mug and set it down next to his hand within easy reach. And she turned and went back to the other room without saying anything at all. That was enough. It was not a small thing. It was the specific kind of support that does not offer an answer. because the person offering it knows that no answer is what is needed, and that what is needed is simply the presence of someone who trusts you enough to let you sit with a hard thing until you have worked it through yourself. The next morning, Eldon drove 6 hours to Denver. He had been preparing for this possibility since 1983, since the year after he bought the certificate, when he first identified the legal doctrine of constructive use, and understood that maintaining a water right without active surface diversion was defensible under Colorado law, if properly documented. He had the documentation. He had 13 years of it. He presented it to the state engineer's office in a manila folder that afternoon, answered 3 questions from a staff attorney, and drove home. The office withdrew 44A from the review list 2 weeks later. He did not tell Vera what the letter had said. He did not tell her about the drive to Denver, or the meeting or the outcome. He simply folded the withdrawal notice into quarters and put it in his coat pocket with the receipts, and continued as before. The notebook got a new entry. 1 sentence. It said, 1994. They looked. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. By 2008, there were 28 receipts. First Mesa Bank had been sold to First Southwest Regional in 1998. Vernon Gaines had moved to Regional VP, and then in 2005 to a senior position at First Southwest's corporate office in Albuquerque. In 2008, Mesa Verde Holdings, an agricultural investment group, backed by institutional capital, acquired First Southwest Regional and all its subsidiary holdings in a transaction that was reported in the Denver Business Journal and noted in the Colorado agricultural press as a significant consolidation in the Western regional market. Vernon Gaines had retired by then, or was very close to it. The bank that bore his management for years had passed through 2 sets of owners and was now part of something larger that had its own plans for the land it held. Eldon read about the acquisition in the paper. He wrote the date and the acquiring entity's name in the notebook. He wrote the names of the subsidiary companies he could identify from the filing. He drew a line connecting Mesa Verde Holdings to First Southwest Regional, to First Mesa Bank, and to the parcel records he had been tracking in the Eastern County for 15 years. Then he wrote one more thing. He wrote, "They are still assembling. They will need the aquifer eventually. Sooner if the water gets worse." It was 2008. He was 80 years old. He paid his $45 that April, same as always. Clara came home for Thanksgiving in 2019. She was 61 and had spent 23 years in Denver practicing water rights law, first at a large firm and then on her own. And she had the professional confidence of a person who has spent 2 decades being exactly right about things that other people found complicated. She drove a truck that was 11 years old because she preferred trucks and saw no reason to replace something that worked. She had been home for Thanksgiving every year that geography allowed, and she knew the kitchen table and the notebook on the shelf beside the window. The way you know the permanent objects of a childhood home as furniture rather than as information. That year, for a reason she later said she could not precisely identify, she took the notebook off the shelf and sat down at the table and opened it. She read for 25 minutes. She did not speak. Eldon sat across from her with a cup of coffee and said nothing, watching her read with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting for a specific person to arrive at a specific understanding at whatever pace that understanding required. When Clara looked up, her reading glasses were in her hand, and her expression had the quality of a person who is just located in a document they had casually handled for decades, something that fundamentally reorganizes everything they thought they knew about the room they were sitting in. She said, "Dad, do you know what this means if they need this aquifer?" Eldon said he had known since 1981. She said, "And you never told anyone." He looked out the window at the fence line and the juniper trees in the particular gray of a November sky over La Plata County. He said there had not been a need yet. Clara sat with that for a moment. She set the notebook down on the table between them. She looked at her father, 91 years old, hands still substantial. Stillness still intact. Coffee cooling in the mug he had not lifted in several minutes. She said, "Tell me everything," and he did, quietly, without drama, in the unhurried and specific language of a man who had been preparing this explanation for 38 years, and had simply been waiting for the right person to sit across from him and ask. By the time the coffee was cold and the November light had shifted toward evening, Clara understood exactly what her father had built. She understood the 1899 survey and the 1952 seismic event and the subsurface hydraulics and the prior appropriation doctrine and the $45 and the receipts and the 1994 review and the notebook entries that tracked the consolidation of Eastern County land into a single corporate entity that was now in 2019 sitting on top of an aquifer it needed and did not yet know it could not simply take. She picked up her phone and looked at her calendar and made a note to pull the current Mesa Verde Holdings filing from the Colorado Secretary of State database when she got back to Denver. Then she closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf where it had always been. Outside, the juniper trees moved in the November wind. The mountains to the north held the last of the afternoon light on their upper faces. Somewhere to the east, beneath 60 feet of limestone and gravel and ancient geological patience, the water that Dyer Creek had sent underground in 1957 sat in the dark and waited the same way it had always waited. The same way a certain kind of man learns to wait, which is without anxiety and without announcement, and with the absolute certainty that the waiting is the work. The summer of 2021 came to La Plata County the way a creditor comes to a door that has been avoided too long, which is to say, without apology and without patience, and with the full weight of something that had been building for years pressing behind it. The drought had not arrived suddenly. Droughts of this magnitude never do. They accumulate the way debt accumulates quietly. At first one dry season following another with just enough recovery between them to allow the hope that the pattern had broken, until the year arrives when the recovery does not come, and the pattern reveals itself not as a series of bad years, but as a single extended condition that had been there all along. The winter snowpack in the San Juan Mountains had been below average for 4 consecutive years. The spring runoff in 2021 came early and thin and was gone by the first week of May. By June, the reservoirs that fed the county's surface irrigation systems were at levels that had not been recorded since the 1950s, and by July, the situation had a word attached to it in the state hydrological reports that the agricultural press printed, and that farmers read at kitchen tables across the region with the specific stillness of people absorbing information they had hoped not to receive. The word was crisis. Mesa Verde Agritech had known the aquifer was there. That was not the problem. The problem, which would not become fully apparent until the summer of 2021, was that they had known about it as a reserve, a contingency, a resource to be developed in the future when surface supplies became insufficient, and they had structured their entire 40,000-acre operation on the assumption that the future was further away than it turned out to be. The irrigation system Mesa Verde had installed across the eastern county farmland was by any reasonable technical standard extraordinary. It had been designed by a firm out of Phoenix that specialized in precision agricultural water management and had completed similar projects in Arizona, New Mexico, and the Central Valley of California. The system used soil moisture sensors placed at quarter-mile intervals across the entire operation, feeding data through cellular modems to a central management platform that ran predictive algorithms developed in partnership with a university agricultural engineering program. There were 47 miles of buried mainline pipe. There were 11 pumping stations with automated pressure management. There were weather monitoring arrays that communicated with the irrigation schedule in real time, adjusting delivery based on evapotranspiration calculations that updated every 15 minutes. The total investment in the technology infrastructure alone, separate from the land acquisition and the physical pipe and the pumping equipment, was $2,300,000. In the second week of July 2021, the wells that fed the system began to fail. Not all at once. That would have been simpler in a certain way because a complete failure has a clarity to it that partial failure lacks. They failed the way the drought had arrived incrementally, one unit and then another. The pressure readings dropping at pumping station 3 first, then 7, then 2, then in a cascade that the management platform's algorithms had not been designed to handle because the scenario the algorithms modeled assumed surface drawdown, not aquifer depletion. And the distinction mattered enormously in terms of what the system could do about it. What the system could do about it was very little. The screens in the monitoring center in the operations building outside Durango showed the readings in real time, and the readings told a story that the platform's diagnostic software communicated in the only language available to it, which was a status indicator in the upper right corner of the primary display that had been green for 14 months and was now red, and beneath the red indicator, a single word that appeared in white text on a dark background, and that remained there for the rest of that summer and into the fall, unchanged, while the corn and soybean fields across 40,000 acres moved through the stages of water stress that agronomists describe in clinical terms, and that farmers describe in the language of watching something they built die in front of them. The word was error. The project manager, a man named Boyd Ketterer, who had come to Mesa Verde from the Phoenix firm that designed the system and who knew the technology better than anyone else on the operational staff, stood in front of the primary display on a Tuesday morning in mid-July and looked at the red indicator for a long time without speaking. He had 3 engineers behind him and a field supervisor who had driven in from the western edge of the operation at 5 in the morning because the pressure readings at Station 7 had dropped to 0 overnight. Boyd said that the shallow formation was gone. He said it the way engineers say things they have calculated correctly and wish they had calculated wrong. He said the deep formation, the ancient aquifer layer, still showed pressure on the geological survey they had commissioned when they first acquired the land. He said the survey had identified it as a potential secondary source. He said they needed to get a drilling team out there and find out how to access it. The geological team arrived the following week. They were good. They had the original survey Mesa Verde had commissioned in 2014, and they had a more recent electromagnetic survey that showed the subsurface formation with considerably more resolution than the 2014 data had provided. They identified the aquifer. They mapped its extent. They confirmed that it was deep enough and large enough and sufficiently pressurized to support the operation's water needs through the remainder of the growing season and into the following year. Then the team's senior geologist, a woman who had spent 20 years reading subsurface formations across the arid West and who had developed the particular habit of checking water rights before recommending drilling locations, because she had learned through painful professional experience what happened when you did not pull the La Plata County Water Rights Index and started reading. She found Certificate 44A on the 3rd page of the prior appropriation registry. She read the filing date. She read the priority status. She read the name of the current certificate holder, which the county records showed as Eldon R. Marsh, with an address in La Plata County, and she looked at the continuous maintenance record that accompanied the filing, which showed annual fee payments without interruption from 1981 to the current year. She set the document down on the table in the operations building and looked at Boyd Ketterer and told him they had a problem that had nothing to do with geology. Patrick Drummond received the call that evening at his home in Denver. He was the senior water rights attorney for Mesa Verde Agritech and had been with the company through 3 of its major land acquisitions and 2 of its regulatory disputes. And he had the professional temperament of a man who had handled serious problems before and expected to handle this one with similar efficiency. He asked the right questions. He listened to the answers. He pulled up the Colorado Water Rights database on his laptop while he was still on the phone and found 44A and read it with the focused attention his training required. Then he sat for a moment with the phone against his ear, without speaking, which was not something he did often. The senior right was real. The maintenance record was unbroken. The priority date of 1899 placed it at the absolute top of the appropriation hierarchy for the entire watershed. Any drilling Mesa Verde did into the Dyer Creek aquifer without the consent of the certificate holder would be a taking under Colorado water law, subject to injunction and damages, and the certificate holder would win that case in any state court in Colorado because the law was built precisely to prevent exactly the circumstance Drummond was looking at. He told Boyd that he needed 3 days to assess the situation. He told him to hold off on the drilling permits. He told him not to say anything to the board until he had talked to the certificate holder. He said the name out loud once more while he still had the file on screen. Eldon R. Marsh. He wrote it on the notepad beside his laptop. He circled it once. Boyd flew to La Plata County on a Thursday morning in August. Drummond went with him. They had prepared an offer that Drummond had described to the board as generous, which it was in the sense that it represented a significant sum of money for a certificate that had been purchased for $340 40 years earlier. The sum was $3,500,000. It was a clean purchase price, lump sum, full transfer of the certificate and all associated rights. Drummond had drafted similar acquisition agreements before. They were straightforward documents. He expected this to be a conversation, perhaps 2 conversations, and then a signing. They drove a rental car from Durango to the address in the county records, a property on a county road that ran east off the main highway. A house with a metal roof and a gravel drive, and a stand of juniper trees along the fence line that had been there long enough to be the permanent kind. The kind that grows on land that has not changed hands in a long time. There was a truck in the drive that was older than the rental car they had come in. The house was modest and well-maintained in the way that things are, when the people who maintain them have been doing it for decades and have no intention of stopping. A garden ran along the south side that had been put in seriously and tended seriously, and the whole property had the quality of a place that understood itself, that had settled into exactly what it was and felt no need to be anything else. Drummond knocked. The door was answered by a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the measured look of a person who had been expecting this visit and had decided in advance how she felt about it. She introduced herself as Clara Marsh. She said her father was in the kitchen, and they were welcome to come in. The kitchen was the kind of room that accumulates meaning over a long time. There was a table that had hosted several decades of meals and decisions. There were shelves along one wall with the particular arrangement of books and notebooks and accumulated paperwork that speaks not of disorder, but of a mind that has been working in one place for a very long time. The window above the sink looked north toward the mountains, and the light that came through it in the August morning was the clear, high-altitude light that makes everything it touches look exactly as substantial as it is. Eldon Marsh sat at the table. He was 93 years old. He was not large, and he was not diminished. He had the quality that certain very old people who have lived entirely according to their own understanding of what mattered develop over time, which is a kind of concentrated presence, an absence of waste in how they occupy space and attention. His hands were on the table, the same hands that had done 22 years of county water work. Still substantial. Still the hands of a man who had spent his life in contact with the things he cared about, rather than at a remove from them. There was a coffee mug in front of him. There was the notebook on the shelf behind him, its spine facing the room. Drummond sat down across from him. Boyd took the other chair. Clara remained standing near the counter, which Drummond noted without remarking on. He opened the conversation with the professional courtesy his position required. He explained who he was and who he represented. He said Mesa Verde Agritech was a substantial operation with significant investment in La Plata County and a strong commitment to agricultural productivity in the region. He said the company had become aware of Certificate 44A and its relationship to an aquifer formation they needed to access in order to sustain their operation through an unprecedented drought. He said Mesa Verde was prepared to make Eldon Marsh an offer that would provide exceptional value for a certificate that had been held in administrative status for 40 years. He opened his briefcase. He took out the document package and set it on the table. He placed the cover sheet face up. The figure was in the upper right corner in clean numerals, the way financial documents present significant numbers with the full amount visible at a glance, so that the person looking at it has an immediate and unambiguous understanding of what is being offered. $3,500,000. Drummond watched Eldon look at the figure. He was experienced enough at this part of his work to read the room with some accuracy, to understand from the quality of a person's attention to a number what their internal relationship to that number was, whether they were calculating, whether they were surprised, whether they were pleased. He was not able to read Eldon Marsh's face with any accuracy at all. The old man looked at the figure the way he might look at a weather report for a county he did not live in. He looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee mug and took a slow, deliberate drink and set the mug back down on the table and pushed the document package back across toward Drummond. With 2 fingers, a movement that was neither dramatic nor hurried, the movement of a man returning something that was never his and that he had no interest in making his. He said, "Thank you for coming." Drummond sat with that for a moment. In 31 years of practice, he had been told no many times in many ways, and he had developed a reasonably complete taxonomy of the different kinds of no, and what each one meant in terms of the negotiation that followed. There was the no that meant the number was wrong. There was the no that meant the conditions needed adjustment. There was the no that was performative, designed to establish leverage before the actual conversation began. He wasn't certain which kind of no he was looking at. He said he hoped Eldon understood what the company was prepared to offer, and that this figure represented Mesa Verde's genuine assessment of the certificate's market value and their commitment to a fair transaction. Eldon looked at him, not unkindly, with the attention of a man who has heard what was said and has already processed it completely and has nothing further to add. He said he understood. Drummond looked at Clara, who was still at the counter with her arms folded and her reading glasses still on their cord, watching the table with an expression that Drummond would later describe to colleagues as the expression of someone who already knows the last page of a book you are still reading the middle of. He gathered the document package. He said he hoped Eldon would consider the offer and that he was available to discuss the terms at any time. He left a card on the table. He stood. Boyd stood. Clara showed them to the door. On the porch, Drummond paused. He turned back. He said to Clara professionally without pressure that he hoped she and her father would have a conversation about the long-term implications of declining an offer at this level, and that he would be in touch. Clara said she appreciated him making the trip. She went back inside and closed the door. Drummond stood on the porch for one moment in the August morning. He looked at the juniper trees along the fence. He looked at the older truck in the drive. He got in the rental car. On the drive back to Durango, he did not say much. Boyd asked him what he thought. Drummond said he thought it was going to be more complicated than he had anticipated. He did not yet know how much more complicated. He did not yet know about 1988. Clara found it in October. She had driven down from Denver on a Saturday with her laptop and a request she had filed 2 weeks earlier with the Colorado State Water Court for the complete litigation and administrative history associated with Certificate 44A. The file arrived on a Thursday, and she had read it over 2 evenings at her desk, and then driven down on Saturday because there were things in it that needed to be discussed in person at a kitchen table with her father sitting across from her. The file contained the standard administrative record she had expected: the original 1899 filing, the annual maintenance payments, the 1994 review inquiry, and the subsequent withdrawal. All of it consistent with what she already knew from the notebook. And then at the back of the file in a section that contained correspondence and filings from third parties, she found a document dated March 14th, 1988. It was a petition filed with the State Water Court by an attorney representing First Mesa Bank of La Plata County, requesting a judicial declaration that Certificate 44A be deemed abandoned and void on the grounds of non-use, specifically the absence of active surface diversion from Dyer Creek for a period exceeding 30 years. The petition cited Colorado water law provisions regarding beneficial use and argued that administrative maintenance payments alone without physical diversion of water were insufficient to sustain an appropriative right. The petitioner of record was the bank's then legal representative. The authorizing officer, whose signature appeared on the authorization form attached to the petition, was Vernon Gaines, Vice President, First Mesa Bank. The court had denied the petition in full. The denial cited the Colorado doctrine of constructive use, the continuous payment record, and a supplementary filing from the certificate holder, Eldon R. Marsh, that provided documentation of ongoing beneficial planning and administrative exercise of the right. The denial was dated June 3, 1988. It was clear and unambiguous, and it had the finality that court denials have when the law is not close. Clara read that document 3 times. She sat with it for a long time. Vernon Gaines had known about 44A. He had not simply laughed at an auction and forgotten about it. He had 7 years later attempted to destroy it through litigation, failed, and said nothing. When First Mesa Bank was sold to First Southwest Regional in 1998, the acquisition due diligence would have required a review of material legal proceedings. The 1988 petition and its denial was a material legal proceeding. Vernon Gaines had been a senior officer during that proceeding and had authorized the filing. He would have known it was in the file. When Mesa Verde Holdings acquired First Southwest Regional in 2008, the same due diligence process applied. The same file existed. The same proceeding was part of the bank's legal history. Mesa Verde had invested $340 million in a project whose central vulnerability had been documented in a court filing 33 years before they made the investment. Somewhere in the chain of acquisition and disclosure, that information had not traveled with the asset. Clara wrote in her own notebook, the one she had started keeping in November 2019 when she first read her father's 1988. Vernon knew, filed to kill it, failed, did not disclose, 33 years. She called Vernon Gaines on a Monday evening. She had his number from a professional directory, and she had decided that a direct call was the appropriate method. Not a letter, not a formal inquiry through counsel, but a direct conversation between a lawyer who had found something and a man who had hoped it would remain unfound. Vernon Gaines was 80 years old. He answered on the third ring. His voice had the quality of a man who had been retired for several years and had settled into a life in Durango that involved less professional pressure and more mornings at his own pace, and who was not expecting this call. Clara identified herself. She said she was the daughter of Eldon Marsh and that she was calling in her capacity as a water rights attorney regarding Certificate 44A in La Plata County. She said she had obtained the complete state water court file. She said she was looking at the 1988 petition. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Clara checked to confirm the call was still connected. Vernon said he was not sure what she wanted from him. She said she was not calling to ask for anything. She said she was calling because she wanted him to know she had found it, and that she intended to use it, and that she thought it was appropriate that he hear that from her directly before he read about it somewhere else. Another silence, shorter. He said he had not believed Eldon would still be alive. Clara said her father was 93 years old and had paid his $45 in April, the same as every year. A third silence. Vernon said he was sorry. He said it quietly without elaboration, in the way that apologies are offered, when the person offering them knows they are insufficient, and knows also that they are the only thing available. Clara thanked him for his time. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, and the court file beside it, and the Colorado mountains in the November window doing what they always did, which was exist, without comment on the things that happened beneath them. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting a motion. If you had been in that kitchen with Eldon Marsh when Clara called Mesa Verde's counsel the following week to inform him of the 1988 filing, and if you had been watching Eldon's face while Clara laid out what she had found, and what it meant, you would not have seen surprise. You would not have seen satisfaction. Exactly, though satisfaction was part of it. What you would have seen was the expression of a man who has been watching a particular acre of ground for a very long time, and who has just seen the thing emerge that he always knew was there, and who feels in that moment not triumph but confirmation, which is quieter and more permanent than triumph, and costs less to carry. Eldon had not known about the 1988 petition specifically, but he had known that the $45 and the constructive use documentation he filed in 1994 were not merely administrative exercises. They were a defense. He had built them as a defense because he had understood from the first morning he sat in that county library in 1981, reading a geological survey that nobody else had bothered to read, that the thing he held was valuable enough that someone would eventually try to take it, and that the only way to prevent that was to make taking it legally impossible. He had done that. He had done it one $45 payment at a time for 40 years. And the 1988 petition had tested that defense, and the defense had held. And the fact that Vernon Gaines had tried and failed and said nothing was not a surprise. It was a confirmation of something Eldon had understood about the nature of the thing he held, which was that it was worth more than the people who wanted it were willing to acknowledge until the moment they had no other option. In January of 2022, Mesa Verde Agritech filed an emergency condemnation claim in the federal water court in Denver. It was a substantial filing. Drummond had brought in 2 additional firms to assist with the constitutional arguments, and the brief ran to 230 pages and cited 17 precedent cases and 3 federal statutes and a provision of the Colorado Constitution regarding the relationship between private water rights and public welfare in conditions of declared emergency. The argument was sophisticated and not without merit. The drought was real. The emergency was genuine. The 40,000 acres and the economic activity they represented constituted a significant public interest. The certificate held by a 93-year-old man in La Plata County was, the brief argued, a private right that could not be permitted to obstruct an agricultural system of regional significance in an era of climate-driven water scarcity. Clara read the filing in her Denver office on the day it was served. She read it thoroughly, the way she read everything which was with the professional attention of someone who is looking for what is strong in an argument as much as what is weak. Because what is strong tells you where your work is, and what is weak tells you where theirs is. She called her father that evening. She told him Mesa Verde had filed. She told him the basic shape of their argument. She told him what she thought the outcome would be if they handled it correctly. Eldon asked her one question. He asked if she needed anything from him. She said there was one thing. She said she wanted him to see Dr. Hoffman and have a formal cognitive capacity evaluation done and on record before the hearing. She said Mesa Verde's counsel had not raised the issue of his capacity, but that, in a federal proceeding involving a 93-year-old certificate holder, the question would come up eventually, and she wanted to answer it before it was asked. Eldon was quiet for a moment. Then he said that seemed sensible. The evaluation was completed in March of 2022. Dr. Hoffman, who had been Eldon's physician for 18 years, and had the particular advantage of having observed his patient across nearly 2 decades, rather than in a single clinical encounter, administered a comprehensive cognitive battery and documented the results in a formal report that was signed, notarized, and filed with the court as part of Clara's evidentiary package. The report found Eldon R. Marsh to be fully competent in all domains relevant to legal decision-making. It noted his recall of dates and figures as exceptional. It noted his reasoning about complex, multivariable situations as intact and sophisticated. It noted that in the course of the evaluation, when asked to explain the significance of a water rights priority system, in the context of a senior appropriation certificate, Eldon had provided an explanation that the physician who had consulted a water law textbook to verify the accuracy of the answer found to be entirely correct. Drummond received the report in his office and read it without expression. He set it on his desk. He did not comment on it to the colleagues in the room. There was nothing useful to say. The argument he had been preparing to make when the moment came to make it was no longer available. Clara filed the report as Exhibit A. The motion she filed alongside it was more direct. It cited the 1988 State Water Court denial of the abandonment petition, the continuous payment record from 1981 to the present, and the constructive use documentation from 1994. It argued that Mesa Verde's condemnation claim could not proceed on the basis of public necessity, when the certificate in question had already survived a legal challenge from Mesa Verde's own predecessor entity, and when the failure to disclose that challenge in the chain of acquisition constituted a material deficiency in the title review that Mesa Verde's own legal team had conducted. In other words, Mesa Verde had bought a problem that was already on the record. They had simply not found it. That was not Eldon Marsh's responsibility. The hearing was scheduled for February of 2023. In the weeks before it, Clara drove down to La Plata County twice. She sat with her father at the kitchen table and went through the case. Not the legal strategy specifically, because she knew the legal strategy and he trusted her on it, but the history, the 1899 survey, the 1952 seismic event, the 1981 auction and Vernon gains in the sport coat and the $340. The 1988 petition that Eldon had not known about until Clara found it, and that had confirmed in its failure that the defense he had built was exactly what he had built it to be. On the second of those visits, sitting at the table in the late afternoon with the November light coming through the north window, Eldon took the notebook off the shelf and opened it to the first page. He read a few lines without speaking. Then he turned to a page near the middle and read a few lines there. Then he closed it and set it on the table between them. He said he had written the first entry in that notebook in the county library in the summer of 1981. He said he had written in it periodically for 41 years. He said he had never shown it to anyone except Clara and Clara only in 2019. Clara asked him if he had ever doubted it, if there had ever been a time across those 41 years when he had considered that he might have read it wrong. He was quiet for a long time. The November wind moved through the junipers outside. The coffee in his mug had gone cool. He said yes. He said once. He said the winter of 1994, when the letter came from the state engineer's office, and he sat at that table at 11 at night and permitted himself to consider that possibility. He said he had sat with it for the length of that evening and then driven to Denver the next morning and filed the documentation and not thought about it again. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she asked why he had not told her about that. He said there had been nothing to tell. He said he had sat with it, and then he had handled it, and it had not needed to be a story about doubt. He said it had simply needed to be something he did. Clara picked up the notebook and held it for a moment. She set it back on the shelf where it had always been, spine facing the room. She drove back to Denver the next morning. She had a hearing to prepare for, and the preparation was going to take everything she had, and she intended to give everything she had, because the man who had sat at that table for 43 years keeping a notebook and paying $45 a year and building a defense so thorough that it had survived every challenge that had been brought against it, deserved representation that was equal to the patience he had shown. Outside the La Plata County property, the juniper trees moved in the December wind. The mountains to the north were white above the timberline. Somewhere to the east, beneath 60 feet of limestone and ancient gravel, the water that Dyer Creek had sent underground in 1957 sat in the dark in the same formation it had occupied for centuries, governed by a piece of paper filed in 1899 that a 53-year-old retired irrigation man had bought for $340 on a dry August Saturday, while a man in a Windsor knotted tie stood by the coffee urn and laughed. The water did not know about the laughter. The water did not know about the $2 million management system showing error in the operations building in Durango, or the emergency condemnation filing sitting in the federal water court in Denver, or the 7 lawyers on one side of a conference table and the gray-haired woman on the other. The water simply waited, the way it always had, the way certain things do when they are old enough and deep enough and properly held, when the right hands have kept the right papers in the right pocket for long enough, that what remains is not patience in the ordinary sense, but something closer to geology, something that has absorbed time so completely that time no longer operates on it, the same way it operates on everything else. The hearing was in 6 weeks. Clara was ready. The notebook was on the shelf. The 42 receipts were in the coat pocket. Eldon Marsh was 94 years old, and he had been ready since 1981. The Federal Water Court in Denver occupies the 4th floor of a building on Curtis Street that was designed with the particular institutional gravity that federal buildings in the American West carry, a seriousness of stone and proportion that communicates without words that the things decided inside it have weight and consequence. and that the weight and consequence are not accidental but deliberate, built into the structure. The way water rights are built into the land invisibly and permanently, and with the full force of law behind them. On a Wednesday morning in February of 2023, Clara Marsh arrived at that building at 7:45 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She carried a leather bag that was not new, and a manila folder that contained 3 documents and nothing else. She wore a dark suit and her reading glasses on their cord, and the particular expression of a person who has prepared so thoroughly for something that the preparation itself has become a form of calm. Not the absence of awareness, but its fullest presence. Every contingency already considered, every response already formed. The mind no longer working to be ready because it simply is. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. She found the courtroom. She sat at the respondent's table and opened the manila folder and looked at the 3 documents inside it for perhaps 30 seconds, not reading them. She knew them completely, but orienting herself to them the way a pilot runs through instruments before a flight that has been planned to the finest detail. Then she closed the folder and set it on the table in front of her and looked at the room. Mesa Verde's team arrived at 8:15. There were 6 of them, Drummond and 5 additional attorneys from 2 firms, and they came in with the organized efficiency of a legal team that has prepared a substantial case and knows it, setting up materials at the far table with the practiced movements of people who do this regularly and well. Drummond acknowledged Clara with a professional nod across the room. She returned it, what neither Drummond nor anyone on his team had known until the previous Thursday, when the filing appeared in the court's electronic docket at 4:47 in the afternoon, was that there would be a third party at the table that morning. The Attorney General of the state of Colorado had filed a motion to intervene as amicus curiae in the Mesa Verde condemnation proceeding. The motion was 58 pages. It had been prepared by the AG's Water Rights Division over the preceding 6 weeks, and it argued with the full weight of the state's legal authority behind it that the emergency condemnation claim brought by Mesa Verde Agritech against Certificate 44A threatened a legal precedent that extended far beyond the immediate dispute between a private company and a private certificate holder. Colorado was at that time in the 8th year of a multi-state compact litigation with Nevada and Utah over the allocation of Colorado River water resources, a case that had worked its way through the federal system to a point where the question of how Colorado's prior appropriation doctrine was recognized and enforced under federal law had become central to the state's legal position. The 1899 filing date of Certificate 44A made it one of the oldest continuously maintained senior rights in the La Plata County system. If a federal court voided that certificate under emergency condemnation without the state's ability to assert the primacy of its own water law framework, the implications for Colorado's argument in the compact litigation were in the assessment of the AG's office potentially severe. The state did not intervene to protect Eldon Marsh specifically. The state intervened to protect the doctrine, but the effect was the same. The respondent's table now held not only Clara Marsh and her manila folder, but the full legal apparatus of the Colorado Attorney General's office, 3 additional attorneys, and the institutional authority of a state government that had decided for its own reasons that this particular 43-year-old certificate needed to survive. Drummond read the intervention filing on Thursday evening and called 2 of his partners and spoke to each of them for a long time. When he was done with the calls, he sat at his desk for a while without picking up the phone again. He had managed the condemnation claim as a dispute between a major agricultural corporation and an elderly private citizen, which was a manageable frame. He was now managing a dispute between a major agricultural corporation and an elderly private citizen and the government of the state of Colorado, which was a different kind of case entirely. The kind of case that has a different kind of ending. The judge assigned to the matter was a woman named the Honorable Ruth Becker, who had served on the federal water court for 11 years, after 14 years in state water law practice, and who was known in the legal community that worked this particular terrain as someone who read the documents herself, all of them, and who had a low tolerance for arguments that mistook sophistication for substance. She entered at 8:58, and the room stood and settled, and she arranged her materials and looked at the tables and said they would begin. Drummond presented Mesa Verde's case for 47 minutes. It was a competent presentation. He established the drought conditions with precision, citing state hydrological data and the federal emergency designation for La Plata County water resources. He established the scale of the agricultural operation and its economic significance to the region. He presented the engineering analysis of the aquifer and the operational necessity of accessing it. He argued the constitutional framework for emergency condemnation of private property rights in the service of documented public need, citing the relevant federal statute and 3 supporting precedents. He did not mention 1988. He could not mention 1988 without mentioning what 1988 revealed, which was that his client's predecessor entity had attempted to destroy the very right they were now seeking to condemn had failed, and had not disclosed the attempt or the failure in the acquisition process. That information was already in the record because Clara had put it there. Drummond's only viable approach was to argue around it to establish a framework of public necessity sufficient to override it. He did the best he could with the case he had. The AG's representative spoke for 22 minutes. She established the state's interest without drama and without excess. She made the compact litigation implications clear. She said the state's position was that a senior water right maintained in continuous administrative good standing for over a century could not be voided by condemnation without a legal standard that the current claim did not meet, and that meeting that standard would require the court to create a precedent that would have consequences for Colorado's water law framework well beyond this proceeding. Then it was Clara's turn. She stood. She opened the manila folder. She took out the 3 documents and set them in a line on the table in front of her. The first was Certificate 44A, the original. Filed October 1899, La Plata County, Colorado. The paper had aged to the color that old official documents acquire a warm cream that is not quite yellow, and the text was typewritten in the style of the period, precise and formal, and absolutely unambiguous about what it granted and to whom and with what priority. The second was a set of 42 receipts, each one folded into quarters and then unfolded for this purpose, each one representing an annual maintenance payment of $45 made to the state engineer's office in Denver, the earliest dated April of 1982, and the most recent dated April of 2022. 42 consecutive years, not one missing. One. The third was the State Water Court filing from March of 1988, the petition submitted by counsel for First Mesa Bank and authorized by Vernon Gaines, Vice President, requesting judicial declaration of abandonment for Certificate 44A, and the court's denial of that petition dated June of 1988, with the word "denied" stamped across the authorization page in the red ink that official denials use, which has the quality of finality that red ink on legal documents has always been understood to carry. Clara looked at Judge Becker. She said she would be brief. She said that the certificate her father had purchased in 1981 for $340 had been challenged in this legal system once before in 1988 by an entity that was now Mesa Verde Agritech's predecessor in interest. She said that challenge had been denied on precisely the grounds that Mesa Verde was now asking the court to disregard specifically the continuous maintenance record and the doctrine of constructive use under Colorado law. She said that Mesa Verde had acquired the surrounding land and the institutional history of that predecessor entity in 2008, and that the 1988 proceeding was part of that institutional history, part of the legal record that any competent title review of the acquired assets would have identified. She said that a condemnation claim could not succeed when the condemner's own chain of acquisition included a failed attempt to accomplish through litigation what it was now attempting to accomplish through federal emergency proceedings. And when the failure of that attempt had been documented in this court's own records for 35 years. She said one more thing. She said that her father, Eldon Marsh, was 94 years old, and that he had maintained this certificate through drought years and boom years, and a state administrative review and a prior court challenge, not because he lacked other options, but because he understood what he held and had decided 42 years ago that it was worth holding. She said the court did not need to agree with that decision in order to recognize that it was a lawful one made by a competent person, sustained through every legal mechanism available to him, and entitled to the protection that Colorado water law and federal property rights principles existed to provide. She sat down. Judge Becker looked at the 3 documents on the table. She looked at Drummond. She looked at the AG's representative. She looked at Clara. She looked at the documents again, specifically at the 1988 filing with its red stamp, for a longer moment than she had spent on anything else in the room. Then, she said that she did not find Mesa Verde's condemnation claim sufficient under the applicable standard, that the 1988 proceeding was dispositive regarding the administrative validity of the certificate, and that a claimant could not successfully assert emergency public necessity when the record showed that the same right had been challenged and upheld within the claimant's own chain of institutional interest. She said the motion was denied. She said it took her 4 minutes and 12 seconds from the moment she looked at the 1988 document to the moment the gavel came down, and those 4 minutes and 12 seconds contained within them 42 years of $45 payments, and one winter evening at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee, going cold, and a man deciding not to be afraid of the letter in front of him. The room was quiet for a moment after the gavel. The quality of quiet that follows a ruling of this kind is not the quiet of shock. It is the quiet of adjustment. The sound of several people simultaneously revising their understanding of where they are and what happens next. Drummond sat at his table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him. He looked at Clara across the room without particular expression. She looked back at him the same way. He picked up his phone from the table and held it without dialing. He would need to call the board. He would need to have a conversation about what options remained. He would need to find a way to describe to people who had authorized $340 million in infrastructure what the 4 minutes and 12 seconds they had just experienced meant for the project, and for the investment, and for the growing season that was already beginning to accumulate its demands on a water system that still showed error on the primary display in the Durango Operations Center. He set the phone down. He needed a moment before that call. The negotiation that followed the ruling lasted 19 days. It happened in conference rooms and over telephone calls, and through the exchange of draft documents that moved between Clara's office in Denver and Drummond's office in Denver, and the Mesa Verde corporate offices in Scottsdale, where the board had convened a special session to address what the project manager's latest report described. With the clinical honesty that documents prepared for boards sometimes achieve as a fundamental reassessment of the project's water acquisition strategy, Mesa Verde's first offer after the ruling was a lump sum purchase of $4,200,000 full transfer of Certificate 44A and all associated rights. It was more than the original $3.5 million, and it was offered with the efficiency of a company that had been told no once in a courtroom and had revised upward accordingly. Clara called her father that evening. She told him the number. Eldon was quiet for the moment. Then he said he remembered what he had written in the notebook in the fall of 2003, the evening after the first serious offer, when a different lawyer from a predecessor entity had sat at the kitchen table and left without asking what was in the notebook, which was the single most consequential error that lawyer had made, because what was in the notebook was this. He told Clara to open her copy of the notebook to the page he was referring to. She did. The entry was dated September 2003. It was written in the same clear, economical hand as every other entry, the hand of a man who had learned to write legibly in an era when legibility meant something and had never unlearned it. It said in full, if they come with money, the answer is not money. The answer is time. Not a sale, a lease, monthly, adjusted annually, inherited by my heirs, for as long as the aquifer serves them. That is what the right is worth. Clara read it. She set the copy down on her desk. She said, "How long ago did you write this?" He said 20 years. She said she would handle it. Her response to Mesa Verde's offer was delivered in writing a single page, and it did not contain a counterprice. It contained terms. A permanent water easement, not a sale. Monthly payment of $7,200 adjusted annually, according to the Consumer Price Index. The easement to be transferable in full to the heirs of Eldon Marsh upon his death, and to their heirs after them in perpetuity for as long as Mesa Verde Agritech or any successor entity maintained operational use of the aquifer. Additionally, Mesa Verde to contribute $1,800,000 to the Dyer Creek Watershed Restoration Fund, an entity to be established under Colorado nonprofit law and governed by a board of trustees appointed by the Marsh family, with the mission of supporting water conservation and agricultural sustainability programs in La Plata County. Drummond read the terms in his office and then read them again. He called two of his partners. He called the project manager in Durango. He called the board chair in Scottsdale and spent 40 minutes on the phone explaining what a perpetual easement meant in terms of the project's long-term financial modeling and what the alternative was, which was another growing season without access to the aquifer, which the project manager had assessed as potentially catastrophic for the operation's viability. The board chair asked if there was another option. Drummond said he had looked at every option available. He said the certificate was valid. The ruling was clear. The state had intervened and would intervene again if the company pursued additional litigation, and the certificate holder was represented by a water rights attorney of 30 years' experience who had built a case file so thorough that it had survived everything thrown at it and would survive whatever else was thrown at it. He said that in his professional assessment, the terms on the table were the resolution, and that his recommendation was to accept them. The board chair asked him to say that again. He said it again. The objections came on day 7, day 11, and day 14 of the negotiation. The inflation adjustment was objected to. The perpetual inheritance clause was objected to. The Watershed Restoration Fund was objected to with particular intensity because it represented money flowing out of the company into an entity controlled by the Marsh family with no direct operational benefit to Mesa Verde. Clara's response to each objection was the same. It was not negotiable. On the 15th day, Drummond called her directly. He asked if there was any term she was willing to discuss. She said she was willing to discuss the payment schedule for the Watershed Fund contribution specifically whether Mesa Verde preferred to make it in a single payment or in 3 annual installments. He said that was the only flexibility she was offering. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would call her the following morning. He called at 8:40. He said Mesa Verde accepted all terms. He asked about the payment schedule. She said a single payment within 60 days of signing would be acceptable. He said he would have the draft easement agreement to her by end of week. She thanked him. She ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment. Then she called her father. Eldon answered on the second ring. She told him they had accepted all terms. He said, all right. She said the monthly payments would begin in April, same month as the maintenance fee. He said he had thought it might work out that way. She said she would drive down the following week and they would go over the agreement together before signing. He said that sounded good. He asked if Vera was needed for anything. She said no, just him. He said he would have coffee ready. The signing was held at the La Plata County Clerk's office on a Friday morning in April of 2024. The clerk's office occupied a room in the county building on Arbalest Road, the same building where the auction had been held in August of 1981, though the interior had been renovated twice since then, and the room where the auction had taken place was now a record storage area and looked nothing like itself. Eldon wore the sport coat. It was the same coat, the dark wool blazer that had been a good one when he bought it, and had become over 43 years of significant occasions, simply part of how he moved through the world. He was 96 years old, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man who is aware of what his body costs him and respects the cost without being governed by it. Vera walked beside him. She did not take his arm. She had never been a woman who managed him, and she did not start now. She simply walked beside him the way she had walked beside him for 58 years, which was as a person who had chosen to be there and continued to choose it every day and needed no further demonstration of that choice than presence. Clara was already inside. She had the agreement laid out on the counter. The pages separated and tabbed a pen placed parallel to the right margin of the signature page. The way attorneys place pens when they have prepared a document they are confident in. Drummond was not present. He had sent a junior associate to represent Mesa Verde at the signing, which was a professional decision and also perhaps a personal one. The junior associate was courteous and efficient and handled his portion of the proceedings without incident. Eldon read the agreement himself, all of it. He read slowly in the way of a man who has always read important documents completely and has never felt embarrassed about the time that requires. The junior associate waited. Clara waited. Vera stood near the window and looked at the parking lot outside with the patience of a woman who has spent 58 years married to a man who reads everything. When Eldon was finished reading, he picked up the pen and signed his name on the signature line in the same clear hand he had used to sign the transfer form in 1981, the same hand that had written in the notebook for 42 years, the same hand that had written in April of each year. The amount, $45 on a certified check made out to the state engineer's office in Denver. He set the pen down parallel to where it had been a small, unconscious symmetry. The junior associate signed on behalf of Mesa Verde. The clerk notarized both signatures. Clara took her copy. The junior associate took his. The original went into the county record, which was where it belonged alongside the original 1899 filing that had started everything. 2 documents separated by 125 years that were now, in the formal language of the law, permanently connected. Eldon took his copy of the agreement and folded it into quarters. He put it in the right inside pocket of the sport coat. He now had 43 receipts, the certificate, and the easement agreement in that pocket. 45 pieces of paper. most of them small, all of them folded into the same quarters, a document structure that no filing system would have recognized as such. But that had functioned across 4 decades as the most consequential archive in La Plata County. Outside in the parking lot, he stood for a moment in the April morning. The mountains to the north were clear in the way April mountains are. The winter white still on the upper faces, the lower slopes beginning the slow color change towards spring. The air had the quality of high-altitude April air, thin and clean, and carrying within it the particular promise that people who live in the arid West have learned to receive carefully, which is the promise of water, still distant, still conditional but present. He opened the truck door. He sat in the driver's seat. He took the notebook from the inside left pocket of the sport coat, where it had ridden since 1981, and opened it to the first blank page, which followed 42 years of entries, and was the first such page in the notebook's history. He wrote 4 things. He wrote the date, April 2024. He wrote Certificate 44A. Easement signed. Terms as written September 2003. He wrote $340 to $7,200 per month. Perpetual. For the heirs. And then, below that, a line that was not a calculation or a legal reference or a note of any kind, but simply an observation. The kind an irrigation man makes when he has been reading Land and Water long enough to understand what he is looking at. He wrote Dyer Creek is still running. 60 feet down. Still running. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the left inside pocket. He started the truck and drove home. Vera had lunch on the table. She had made the kind of lunch she made on days when something had been completed, which was not an elaborate lunch, but a deliberate one. The things he preferred prepared without announcement or ceremony. He sat down. She sat down. They ate. She asked if the signing had gone all right. He said it had gone fine. She said good. She poured coffee. He drank it. After lunch, he went to the equipment shed at the back of the property, the old one that had been built before he owned the property, and that he had maintained rather than replaced, which was consistent with his general approach to things. On the back wall of that shed, hung with 2 nails that had been there since the 1980s, was a hand-drawn map of the eastern La Plata County watershed. He had made it himself on drafting paper in the months before the 1981 auction, working from the 1899 Geological Survey and the USGS topographical maps, and his own 22 years of reading that land from the county water office. The map showed Dyer Creek and its tributaries, the surface expression and the subsurface formation, the aquifer boundary as he had estimated it from the survey data, and in the center of it, marked with a small, careful circle, the location of the aquifer's principal pressure zone, the place where the water was deepest and most concentrated and most available and most valuable, the place that Mesa Verde's geological team had identified in the summer of 2021 as the source they needed, which was the same place Eldon had marked on a map in a shed in La Plata County in 1981, and looked at every few years for the next 4 decades without telling anyone where it was. He looked at the map for a long time. He did not take it down. He had made it for a purpose, and the purpose had been fulfilled, and it belonged where it was, which was on the wall of the shed, where he had put it, part of the permanent inventory of the place. He turned off the shed light and went back to the house. Vera was reading in the other room. He sat in his chair near the window. The mountains to the north were doing what they always did in the late afternoon, holding the light on their upper faces, while the valley below moved into shadow, a daily transaction between elevation and sun. that he had watched from this chair for 40 years, and that had never been less than worth watching. Clara called that evening at 7. She said the first payment from Mesa Verde would be processed in May and would deposit directly to the account they had set up. She said the Watershed Fund paperwork would be finalized in 3 weeks. She said the junior associate had called her after the signing to say that Drummond sent his regards, which was a professional courtesy, and nothing more, but which Clara had noted because it was the kind of thing you note. She said one more thing. She said she had been thinking on the drive back to Denver about the notebook. She said she had been thinking about the entry from 1981. The first one, the one he had written in the county library on a wooden table under a fluorescent light that buzzed every 12 seconds. She said she had been thinking about a man who sat alone with a 91-page geological survey written in 1899 and read it completely and understood what it meant, and then drove to an auction and bought a piece of paper that everyone in the room thought was worthless, and drove home and had coffee, and did not tell his wife what he had done or why he had done it. She said she had been thinking about what kind of person does that. Eldon was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought it was the kind of person who had spent 22 years learning to read what water does when nobody is watching it. He said the water had been doing the same thing for a long time. He said he had simply read it correctly and then had the patience to wait for the moment when reading it correctly mattered. Clara said she thought that was probably the most accurate description of what he had done. He said he appreciated her handling the legal part. He said he was aware that his plan required a lawyer at the end, and that the lawyer needed to be the right kind, and that she was the right kind. She said she had learned from a good source. He said, "Good night." She said good night. He set the phone down on the side table. The house was quiet, in the way houses are quiet when they have held a lot of living and are resting now. The particular quiet of a place that has been the site of 40 years of mornings and evenings, and meals and decisions and conversations and silences. The quiet that is not emptiness but accumulation. He looked out the window at the mountains. Dark now, or nearly the last light almost gone from the upper faces, the sky above them moving toward the deep blue that precedes full dark in the high country. The color that has no equivalent anywhere else. The color of elevation and thin air, and the particular clarity of a sky that has been washed clean by altitude. Eldon Marsh was 96 years old. He had paid $45 a year for 43 years, and had been told no in 1988, and had answered the state engineer's letter in 1994, and had pushed a $3.5 million check back across a kitchen table with 2 fingers, and had watched a federal water court judge look at 3 documents for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and bring a gavel down on the right side of 125 years of water law. He had not done any of it for the money, though. The money was real and the easement was permanent, and the payments would go to Clara after him and to Clara's children, after her compounding forward through the years. The same way interest compounds, the same way the aquifer had compounded quietly and invisibly, and with the absolute indifference to urgency that deep things develop when they have been in one place long enough. He had done it because in 1981, in a county library with a buzzing fluorescent light, he had read a geological survey from 1899 and understood something that nobody else in La Plata County had understood, which was that the water had not gone away. It had gone deeper. And that wherever water goes, the question is never whether it is still there. The question is whether the person who knows where it went has had the patience to wait for the moment when that knowledge becomes everything. He had waited. He had kept the papers in order. He had paid the $45. He had mowed the creek bed in June and September and driven past the survey flags and written the names of acquiring entities in a notebook, and sat at a kitchen table in February of 1994 with a cup of coffee going cold, and permitted himself one evening of doubt, and then driven to Denver in the morning and filed the documents, and not thought about it again. The water was still there. The right was still good. The notebook was in his coat pocket. 43 years of $45 payments, and a perpetual easement that would outlast him. The same way the aquifer would outlast him, the same way the mountains to the north would outlast him. With the patient indifference of things that were old enough to know, or that time is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be respected. And that the people who understand this and act accordingly leave something behind them that no drought can reach and no condemnation can touch, and no man standing by an empty coffee urn at a county auction can diminish. With a remark however loud, however confident, however completely certain of what 12 feet of dry creek bed and a dusty certificate are actually worth. Vernon Gaines read the item in the Durango Herald on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the signing. It appeared on page 6, 4 sentences, no names, identifying only that a perpetual water easement had been executed in La Plata County's eastern agricultural corridor, involving a senior prior appropriation certificate dating to 1899. The item was smaller than the items above it and below it on the page, the kind of notice that the Herald ran as a matter of public record, and that most readers moved past without stopping. Vernon stopped. He was 83 years old, and he lived in a house in Durango that he had bought when he retired, and that was comfortable without being large. And he read the Herald in the morning at a table by the window with coffee, the same way he had read the paper. His whole adult life, the way habits of a professional career persist long after the career is over. He read the item twice. He set the paper down on the table. He looked out the window at the street outside, at the ordinary Saturday morning traffic of a Colorado mountain town. People walking dogs and driving to the hardware store and going about the accumulated ordinary business of their lives. He sat for a long time. He thought about an August morning in 1981. He thought about a county building on Arbalez Road and a coffee urn that had run empty before 9. And a man in a sport coat sitting in the second row and raising his hand when the number reached $340. He thought about what he had said, and the 2 or 3 people who had laughed, and the sound of that laughter in a room that was now 43 years later. Part of the only story he knew of that had an ending like this one. He had tried to undo it in 1988. He had filed the papers and made the argument, and the court had denied it. And he had not said anything to anyone, and had told himself it did not matter, because the old man would sell eventually, or the right would lapse eventually, or something would eventually make the whole situation resolve itself in a way that did not require him to account for the error he had made on an August morning when he was 40 years old. And certain he understood something that a retired irrigation man in a sport coat did not. The old man had not sold. The right had not lapsed. Nothing had resolved itself in that direction. The only resolution that had come was the one on page 6 of the Durango Herald on a Saturday morning. 4 sentences, no names, a perpetual easement executed in the eastern corridor, and Vernon Gaines sitting at a table by a window, understanding at 83. With the particular clarity that comes when there is nothing left to misunderstand, that the man he had laughed at in 1981 had been right about everything and had known he was right about everything and had needed nothing from Vernon Gaines except to be left alone to wait for the moment when being right would pay $7,200 a month for the rest of his heirs' lives and beyond. Vernon picked up the paper. He folded it closed. He set it on the table beside his coffee cup. He did not say anything to anyone because there was no one to say anything to, and because what would be said did not improve anything and did not change anything, and served no purpose that Vernon could identify except to make explicit in words what the silence already contained completely. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. Some lessons do not need a witness to be complete. Vernon Gaines sat at his table by the window in Durango and looked at the street and understood something that it had taken him 43 years to fully understand, which is that a man standing by an empty coffee urn at a county auction who laughs at the price another man pays for a piece of paper he has read more carefully than anyone else in the room is not demonstrating knowledge. He is demonstrating its absence. And the distance between those two things, between the laugh and the silence 43 years later, is not a mystery. It is a measurement of patience, of attention, of the particular kind of faith that is not religious but geological. The faith of a man who pressed his hands against the land long enough to know what was underneath it, and then had the discipline to wait until the world needed what only he had taken the trouble to find. In La Plata County on that same Saturday morning, Eldon Marsh sat on the porch step in the April sun with a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains and listened to the juniper trees along the fence line, doing what they always did, which was exactly nothing, which was exactly enough. The $45 fee was no longer due. The notebook had its first new entry in 42 years. The coat pocket held 45 pieces of folded paper, and the weight of them was the same weight it had always been. Not heavy, not light. Just present the specific gravity of things that have been carried correctly for long enough that they have become simply part of how a man moves through the world. Somewhere to the east, 60 feet below the surface of the county, he had spent his life reading the water that Dyer Creek had sent underground in 1957, moved through limestone and ancient gravel in the unhurried way that water moves when it has been in one place long enough to know exactly where it is going. It had been waiting a long time. So had the man who knew it was there. Neither of them had been in any particular hurry. Neither of them had needed to be.